Welcome to Big City, Small Town, the show about the people that make San Antonio go and grow. I'm Cory Ames, your host this week, as I'm revisiting a conversation that feels even more relevant today than when we first recorded it. I sat down with Stephanie Phillips, San Antonio's Senior Program Manager for Deconstruction and the Circular Economy. Stephanie has what might be one of the most forward-looking roles in city government anywhere in the country. And in this interview, she shares how San Antonio became the largest city in North America with a deconstruction ordinance, why our built environment holds more value than we realize, and how slowing down demolition can preserve history, reduce waste, and even strengthen our San Antonio community. It's a thoughtful look at how San Antonio is leading the way in rethinking growth and reuse, and why this city, with its deep heritage and close-knit connections, might be the perfect place to pioneer a circular economy. Here's my conversation with Stephanie Phillips.
I am a senior program manager for the city's Deconstruction and Circular Economy program, which was formally created in 2022. So it's a very new program, and I'm so excited that I'm the first person to have what I think is the coolest job title in the city and the country. You don't have a lot of people in city government that have circular economy or deconstruction in their title because it's such a new program. And the Deconstruction and Circular Economy program administers the city's Deconstruction Ordinance, which was adopted almost exactly 2 years ago. So we make sure that older building stock gets deconstructed instead of demolished. And we also work to grow basically our building materials reuse ecosystem through facilities like our Material Innovation Center and workforce training efforts like our deconstruction contractor training program. And outside of that, I do a lot of stuff that's related to reuse and embodied carbon because that's my passion. And the biggest thing is recently co-launching Circular San Antonio, which is a local nonprofit seeking to scale circular efforts here too.
All right, well, a lot that we will certainly get into, but I'm interested first if you could tell me about the story as to how embodied carbon and reuse became your passion. Because I imagine that those were terms first and foremost that you kind of had to discover yourself.
Exactly. So I have a background in interior architecture and a graduate degree in historic preservation from UT. So that's how I got to Texas. And historic preservation is kind of a loaded term, but the way that I consider it is a form of retaining materials, stories, cultural heritage in our cities. And San Antonio is probably the best city in the country to be working in this field. But just recently, I would say in the past 5 years or so, the term embodied carbon has become more synonymous with historic preservation. And essentially, what embodied carbon is all of the energy and time and effort and materials that went into constructing our buildings. So the bricks that hold up this building, the wood that holds up our houses is a form of embodied carbon. And all of that energy is locked into those materials. So it's already been expended. And this is in contrast to operational energy, which I think a lot more people are familiar with, or operational carbon, which is the energy required to power and cool and run our buildings. So I kind of look at as embodied carbon as a way to retain that energy that already exists. So making sure that our buildings can stand and be adapted instead of demolished and thrown away, which necessitates even more energy to be expended.
Well, so how did you get there, working now in deconstruction? Um, when, from what I understand, what I could look up, that your original interest was in interior design.
Yeah. So I have a professional degree in interior design, but pretty early on in that education, I realized that I was more interested in working with existing buildings versus, getting a floor plan and designing in a bubble or designing for Anywhere USA. And part of that was because of my environment. I went to undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and they have one of the most incredible pedestrian-only main thoroughfares in State Street, and it's just lined with older buildings. It's kind of the textbook example of how we built our cities before we catered to cars. So I always loved, working with those buildings and imagining repurposing those instead of creating something brand new. And from that, I pursued my graduate degree in historic preservation originally to potentially become an interior architect or architect that focused on adaptive reuse. But I learned pretty quickly as well that I didn't want to be an architect. I was more interested in the community engagement piece that came with urban planning, working with communities directly and having, kind of seeing the impact of your work in real time, which isn't always possible when you're designing a building because the
Hmm.
lead time for that takes a while. So that's kind of how I transitioned into that space.
Mm. And so growing up, was there any sort of I don't know, upbringing, influence, or what have you, to encourage you to think about our built environment in a different way? Can you track that back in any sort of way?
I really do think like the kicker was in college.
Mm.
I grew up in the suburb of Milwaukee in a 1970s, 1980s like track suburb. And my parents still own the house I grew up in. Like it's very nostalgic and my hometown is very important to me. But I kind of learned after being exposed to like a city like Madison and living in that downtown experience that this is the environment that I thrive in, especially because it offers more diversity of experience and people and connections in a more concentrated space. And you don't need a car to do it.
Mm.
So I think that's really where my love for resource use and, connecting people and urban planning and policy making for a sustainable world kind of popped into my head. And a lot of that is actually retroactive thinking. I never thought I would work in local government ever, even after I graduated grad school. But when I think back to all of the things that I was innately curious about, it makes a lot of sense why I'm here.
Mm. Well, and then from Midwest down to Texas and now specifically San Antonio, what is it like then to be working not only in local government, but local government here in San Antonio? How do you feel being in the position that you are?
I feel incredibly fortunate. I think San Antonio is one of the best places to be in a lot of ways. And for me, I went to graduate school in Austin, and I was there from 2013 to 2015, and that's kind of right around the cusp of, like, the boom that we associate with Austin's, like, rapid growth, and it's really interesting to come down here and be a part of that now and see what that meant in Austin without really the strategies and the tools to mitigate growth and kind of balance the environmental integrity of a city, the cultural, historic, physical buildings of that city. We've kind of always seen like that moving down the corridor in
Mhm.
San Antonio. So since 2017, I've been so fortunate to be in a role and a department that plays such a big part in how our city is planned and growing and facilitate those conversations with architects, developers, community members. It's just an incredible playground in a way to work and live.
Could you give us an explanation of what the day to day looks like for your position and perhaps what that connects, or specifically the deconstruction ordinance that you already mentioned? Can you give us greater detail as to what that is, what the implications are for our city, and how that ties to your day to day?
When I joined the Office of Historic Preservation in 2017, I was a senior case manager for our Landmarks Commission. So, working with architects and homeowners on decisions that they were making with their properties and helping them navigate those decisions. And right around that time, City Council issued a council consideration request to our department and our peer departments like development services to look at all of the demolition policies that were on the books. And this was largely in response to a community effort around the pace and location of primarily single family and missing middle housing that
Mm.
was being more readily demolished as the city started to grow, right? So that was a really big inflection point from a policy perspective. And those constituents kind of advocated to their city council member to, see, can we be doing something better from a city administration standpoint around demolition? And from that came the idea of a potential deconstruction policy or program
Mm.
and what that means. So, as buildings are going through the process, the decision making, the permitting process to be demolished or be removed, there are a few inflection points where, especially in our office, we have community members coming to us saying, we actually need to save this building. This building is really important to us, but it may not have historic protections. So it's really, really difficult to stop the removal of that
Mm.
building. And this is some of the testimony that we heard, like in those early days of this policy discussion is, one day I could see a building that really means something to me, and the next day it's smashed and gone. And that can be really fracturing and almost violent for communities if that critical resource that has been part of their living heritage, honestly, for a long time is
Mhm.
just gone. And from that came the idea of deconstruction, which is slowing down the demolition process. It's basically unbuilding a building in the opposite way it was constructed or reverse engineering. So instead of heavy machinery smashing a building and throwing it into a landfill in a matter of days,
Mhm.
you have people slowly dismantling from the roof down to the foundation and salvaging those materials for reuse. So that's the, process that we wanted to see more of. I think some of the best policies, especially at the local level, come out of the idea of there is something happening in my community that I don't think is right and I don't think is
Mhm.
benefiting me. And this is just one of those examples.
Mm. Well, I mean, it seems that there's a much greater opportunity following more intentional deconstruction to keep some cultural continuity,
Mm.
as it seems you're saying. My brother-in-law calls one of the new styles of like modular developments space barns.
Mhm.
I think we're all kind of familiar with that look.
Yeah.
Austin's really prevalent with them. San Antonio's getting its fair share of them. But you kind of imagine 20 to 30 years down the line thinking like, it stands out currently like kind of, a sore thumb, but it doesn't really fit, in this style. And it's something that's really kind of templated.
Right.
And you start to see it whether you're in Boise, Idaho, another city where I have family live, uh, growing very fast and changing, Austin or San Antonio. And that, you know,
Mhm.
breaks my heart a little bit. But I'm curious to what would you say to someone who hears that and says like that is a really good idea. It's a pleasant idea, but to me, someone slowly deconstructing a building and salvaging materials, that sounds maybe inconvenient and maybe expensive. What would you say to someone with that kind of response?
Yeah. So our deconstruction ordinance was adopted in 2022, and we started talking about a policy in 2017, 2018. So we spent about 4.5 years kind of interrogating those exact questions
Mm,
with a deconstruction advisory committee, which had anyone from our real estate council, which is, the development arm, advocacy arm of San Antonio, to environmental advocates, preservation advocates, solid waste, and affordable housing experts. And I loved that. I think it's such a great tool to develop policy because you have a lot of people coming together in a room pretty consistently that would
mhm,
never share space with each other
yeah,
or very rarely. And that affords the ability for those people to hear each other out and say, you know, this may slow down my development process, but another person may say, okay, and
mm,
it's going to benefit our environment. We're going to have more access to building materials in our community. And it allows those people to have those discussions. So we kind of almost in a way held space for those conversations to happen and stood back and said, what would a policy look like for San Antonio specifically versus like copying one from a different city? So time and cost, I don't think is something that is ameliorated by
mhm,
this policy or by deconstruction in general. It's always going to be a concern. But in the same way that we talk about any other development and environmental policy, it's like, what what are we losing or who is getting the brunt of the negative externalities to save $3,000
mm,
or to save 4 days of time?
mm,
And the answer to that through our research, through our engagement, through connecting with our city council members and our constituents was the community.
mhm,
Demolition is, like I mentioned, violent and fracturing. It is a form of air pollution. Even if you do it best by spraying down a site, you have particulate matter spreading 200, 400, 600 yards away from a site. I always say demolition doesn't happen in a bubble,
mhm,
and demolition happens to buildings, but it also happens to people. So, spraying down a site, that particular matter can get into our groundwater. And it's just something that we as a society have been kind of conditioned to accept because I know in my generation, I never knew anything different than
yeah,
demolition to remove buildings, right? Like, I loved climbing on cool bulldozers and playing Tonka games when I was growing up. That was just something that you constantly saw. But when you recognize how damaging that way of removing buildings can be, it becomes really challenging to justify it in any way.
if the world was Stephanie's kind of utopian vision, at least San Antonio specifically, and deconstruction was the blanket policy and the way in which we operated with buildings that had maybe seen the extent of their useful life, needed to be repurposed or what have you. Um, what would be the challenges or barriers in the way to scaling
Mhm.
deconstruction so that we could apply it on a citywide level, a region level?
Mhm.
What's in our way from being able to do that?
I love that question because we get a lot of questions about, are we expanding our ordinance? Are we including commercial? Are we looking into newer buildings? And there are a few cities across the country who have deconstruction regulations for every single building in their city.
Mm,
A few of them are Boulder, Colorado, and Palo Alto, California, and they're aiming to have 85% diversion rates in some cases for the entirety of the building. And it's so incredible and something that I think we hope to aspire to. Of course, if you know geographies and know city size, those are a lot smaller cities than San Antonio, so you have to start somewhere. I think some key barriers to scaling it are workforce. That's such a big component of our program is workforce training because in order to effectively regulate a policy, you need to make sure that you have the people that can do the work on behalf of people that are hiring them.
mhm,
So even before, well before, several years before we adopted our ordinance, we launched our certified deconstruction contractor training program where we bring in a national trainer. We typically hire Repurpose Savannah, which is an all women plus led deconstruction nonprofit in Savannah, Georgia, that trains people how to fully remove buildings, but then also gives them the tools to launch their own reuse center. So they take down buildings and they also sell those materials to their communities. So they're actually going to be here in October, leading to more cohorts of deconstruction contractor training programs so we can get even more people locally to do that work. And I think another barrier is actually just how the way we built buildings
mhm,
changed pretty rapidly after World War II. So currently, our deconstruction ordinance requires houses built before 1945 in certain areas to be deconstructed. And that was a very strategic date
yeah.
because after World War II, you started to see a lot more mass production introduced and a lot more things that make it difficult to unbuild a building, like glues, mastics, staples, basically gluing a bunch of building materials together, which is very different than kind of the Lincoln Logs strategy of how we used to build buildings before World War II. So we're kind of thinking about that as well. There are a few companies and researchers across the country that are figuring out ways to do that, which is super exciting. And I hope we'll be able to bring some of that technology and workforce training to San Antonio to scale it in the future.
Mm. And does your department have, I mean, you mentioned the Savannah organization for one. Is there something of a national network that you feel like you're developing or have developed in these conversations around deconstruction?
Absolutely. I always say that we would have never been able to achieve our deconstruction ordinance, which I can't believe I haven't said yet, is the largest in North America. We are the largest city in North America to have a deconstruction ordinance, which I always like to say because we are in San Antonio. And every time I come across someone on the West Coast or the East Coast or Canada or across the world that hasn't heard about our policy, they're like, Texas? Really? And I'm like, hell yeah, in Texas. So, we learned so much from the city of Portland, Oregon. They were the first city in North America to adopt a policy like this in 2016. And I have to get a shout out to Sean Wood. He was basically my equivalent at the city of Portland, and he's now at the EPA,
Mm,
helping cities and communities with low carbon materials. He really helped us, approach our policy effort. And that kind of made me realize that the only way that we're going to affect local change and something that's so new is through the resource sharing and partnership of communities around the country. So I sit on the board of a national nonprofit called Build Reuse, and it's the major nonprofit in the United States that seeks to turn construction and demolition waste into local resources. So that has been my network and my safe space, if you will, to kind of get out of my bubble and learn more about how other people are approaching this really important topic.
mm. And so You may have mentioned it already, but specifically, the ordinance requires deconstruction for buildings built before 1945. Is that the extent of the ordinance? And then a follow up on that. If you were to take it further, and maybe it is completely conditional based off of the research and the strategy necessary to be able to deconstruct other buildings that were built at different eras, but where would you take it further?
hmm So right now we have 3 phases of the ordinance that were adopted in 2022. So we're currently in the second phase, and that states that any residential building, fourplex or smaller, so down to single family, built in 1920 anywhere in the city has to be deconstructed, and 1945 in historic districts and neighborhood conservation districts, so kind of those protected zoning overlays. But our ordinance is actually expanding into its final phase, January 1 of 2025, and that will expand to 1945 and earlier anywhere in the city
Mm,
and go up to eightplex and smaller. So kind of that missing middle housing if it's coming down, and 1960 and earlier in those protected districts. So we're starting to creep into some of those newer buildings.
gotcha.
And part of the reason why it's so strategically, slow growth. I always say that we wanted to take like bite-sized pieces out of our demolition stream to make sure that our workforce and our reuse ecosystem was growing alongside the regulation.
Mm,
We've seen some communities across the country that bit off more than they could chew and maybe didn't invest in workforce development or wanted to do every single building, right, without those strategic investments. And they've had to pause or stay their ordinances because it just was too much of a disruption.
mm,
So ours is very intentional and it is very much rooted in the realities in San Antonio. We looked at 10 years of demolition data to see, can we hone in on a build date and a building type and a building year
mm,
that started with 33% and then grew to 45% and then grew to 65% of housing demolitions to be incremental in that strategic way. So I think it was smart, even though the environmentalist in me wanted to be like, let's get everything.
yeah.
So I think my dream and where we might go in the future, this would require a future ordinance and a ton more in community engagement, basically restarting what we did 5 years ago, is looking into commercial structures and potentially looking into major renovations of buildings. A lot of construction and demolition waste is generated through gut rehabs. So we do have a lot of community members coming to us saying, I see dumpsters and dumpsters in old homes next to me that are being completely gutted, and that material is just as valuable as a house that's being fully removed. What can we do?
Mm,
So I think hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to restart those conversations.
mm. So demolition is one category, renovation another one, and then
Mhm.
that between residential and commercial.
Yep.
Is there anything that stretches to the prospect of conditions for what new builds look like, one way or another, residential or commercial, or would that be a different department?
I think that we may co-lead on that. I'm so glad you asked that because that's also kind of on our radar. We we kind of have an example of what we could do in our existing 2% for public art ordinance, where city projects have to invest 2% of their budget into public art for a
Mm,
new building. And we're thinking 2% reclaimed materials in some sort of visible aspect of the building,
mhm,
like an overhang or cladding, or even reuse materials for public art. So what I always say that the deconstruction ordinance is kind of focused on the supply side,
mhm,
making sure that we're intercepting all of these millions of tons of materials that are going to the landfill and redirecting them back into our communities so they can be productively used. And then what you're describing is more on the demand side. How can we generate more incentives or more regulations to inspire or require people to think reuse first
mm,
instead of relying on virgin materials?
right. And so where do we feel like we are in that establishing that supply chain? Is there just by no means enough supply, or is there a mismatch in the level of demand right now? It's interesting how that's just a completely different supply chain, a much more localized one,
hmm
hyper localized supply chain.
Yep.
But where are we, do you think, in that system flowing more smoothly?
Yeah.
Where's the choke point?
I think a big barrier right now is volume and consistency. And this is where the Material Innovation Center comes in a little bit, is that we work I love working with architects. I love chatting the ear off of designers and specifiers, asking them those questions because
Mhm.
we have so many architects in San Antonio that are environmental leaders and they want to specify reclaimed. But when we think about large buildings like community centers or apartment buildings, that requires a lot of material and a lot of consistent material.
Mm.
And part of the charm and excitement of reclaimed building materials is kind of the uniqueness of those. But when you're so used to an architecture industry that relies on volume and consistency,
Yeah.
that is a remarkable barrier. And that's not just a San Antonio thing, it's really a worldwide thing. So I think we do have a lot more work to do here to, you know, offer more storage or offer more investment or incentivize more startups and established building material innovators to invest in San Antonio and make it a circular city for our built environment to
Mhm.
address those two key barriers, volume and consistency.
Where might there be some other savings for us, in using more of, these reclaimed materials that we wouldn't otherwise consider?
Yeah, I think one aspect that I pretty consistently think about is that if we use more of the materials that are readily available in our communities and started referring to like our houses, like the ones that are being deconstructed as urban forests because
Mm.
they were constructed of old growth lumber, that was felled hundreds of years ago and they grew for thousands of years in some ways.
Yeah.
And um, if we use more reclaimed materials, it reduces the demand for virgin materials, whether that be virgin forests and virgin lumber, or more commonly right now in our society is plastic and petroleum based building materials. So I think that's one thing that we try to elevate more often is that if you go more reclaimed and if we do that more as a society, then
Mm.
we're leveraging more of the resources that already exist, to your point, hyper locally,
Mhm.
instead of relying on mining our earth for more.
Mhm.
So I think that's one interesting way of considering it.
And so, do you imagine that, like, the sticker shock would be too high for developers or anything like that from the get-go? Or perhaps with the greater prevalence of reclaimed materials, that costs would go down?
Yeah. So I think COVID was a really big eye opener. Um, if you recall back in 2021, 2022, or if you blocked it out like me, which is great for our mental health. But there was such a barrier price wise and access wise for construction materials because a lot of people were pursuing those kind of projects. And as a result, supply chains were choked in various different ways. And more importantly, lead times, just the time it would take to access those materials became longer. And
Mhm.
time is money in the development world. So I think that was a really big eye opener on like how much we rely on those worldwide supply chains. And largely as a consumer, as a homeowner myself, like I have no idea where like my Elm table came from. I have no
Mhm.
idea where those materials had to go or travel to be put together. But if we're relying on this hyper local source, especially now that we have more materials entering the San Antonio ecosystem because of deconstruction, it just makes us more resilient as a community when we're talking about access to those materials. So the more materials we have in our ecosystem instead of going to the landfill, the more accessible they are and the more affordable they can be.
Mm.
So that's a really big focus for us too.
And so then currently on the design and build side, architects, developers or otherwise, is the door open in some regard if they wanted to get involved in using more reclaimed materials, and thinking about projects that way?
Mhm.
Where would they get started? Do they reach out to you?
Yes. I feel like I'm like a not a call center, but like I always get emails multiple times a week or calls from both property owners and even developers, like affordable housing developers or developers that are looking for something that is uniquely San Antonio, right? I also think this is a bit of a diversion, but just to emphasize how I think our building industry and our design industry is kind of shifting away from like the builder grade style that was so prevalent in the past decade or so into something that is more locally true to where we are.
Mhm.
So we have a lot of people reaching out to us saying, I want to build a custom curtain wall out of reclaimed lumber from a local building because you can't manufacture
Mhm.
authenticity. Or more commonly, we have property owners saying, I need to restore my home or I'm building an addition to my 1920s building. I want to use the same hardwood. I want
Mhm.
to use the same siding. I want to use similar doors. Where can I find that? And we're very fortunate to be able to point to a lot of reclaimed stores and deconstruction contractors that can supply that for people. So the door is consistently open. And one of my favorite examples about deconstruction in practice is I said at the beginning that demolition happens in a day or two. It's very quick, it's very violent, it's very fracturing and fracturing emotionally and physically. You're like
Mhm.
splintering all of those materials, you can't reuse them. But when you slow down that process, it's every single deconstruction project without fail, especially in a dense legacy community. Neighbors shop the site.
Mm.
I started comparing it to like knocking on your neighbor's door for a cup of sugar, but now you're knocking on your neighbor's door for some shiplap or for some siding. And that happens every single time
Mm.
because you're affording that process to happen. And that to me is the definition of a microcircular economy. Like you can't create a better ecosystem footprint wise than that. So the more we do that, the more people can access that. And then I will say that there's a growing trend of people just being more cognizant that that's an option.
Mm. Well, and it seems like too, uh, with that opportunity just to be able to more sensibly use and reuse the materials that exist within your own community, your own ecosystem, seems like a much greater sense of pride
Hmm.
can grow in the built environment that surrounds you. Like you said, it's already something that is so can be so devastating as things are demolished and changed, and something new is there that may not have the same sort of cohesive look and
Hmm.
feel and kind of cultural um, uh, character.
Right.
And so it seems like there's a great opportunity for us as San Antonians to take pride in that and start to add little bit of our reclaimed materials to our new projects and renovations and those kinds of things. Stephanie, I'm curious to get to your work outside your day job
Hmm.
too, the nonprofit organization that you co-founded. And I'd like to get to that by as well framing it in a question. Why do you think San Antonio, and maybe already layered through our conversation thus far, but why do you think this city is so apt and well suited to advance this movement for a more circular economy?
Circular San Antonio, like you mentioned, is a nonprofit organization that really seeks to help San Antonio transition to a more circular city. And what that really means is to tip the scales in favor of reuse instead of kind of the linear economy that we're used to, which is single use, overconsumption, a lot of waste. And that is not just a San Antonio problem, it's a worldwide
Mm.
problem. But I know from my own work and working locally and kind of leveraging the skills and energy of our community and the talents as well, is that if we come together for this common cause, like we can move that needle. And I think that San Antonio is the perfect city for this to happen because we value our existing resources in a very unique way compared to other cities that I've visited or I've lived in. And I think some of that stems from the big city, small town identity that we're so proud of, where
Mm.
people are connected to literally everyone. It shocks me every day in every conversation that I have is that there's 6 degrees of everyone that lives in San Antonio. And so there's already this kind of cohesive network of people being able to tap into their skills and abilities and interests. But then I also think it stems from honestly the fact that we're a World Heritage city and there's such an important identity tied to our cultural heritage.
Mm.
And I mean every single layer about our cultural heritage, even if it's a little bit messy and complicated. Because that identity that we've been able to maintain in our built environment and our cultural legacy is the foundation for us to continue to reinvest in what makes us unique and what drives our local industries. So one big thing that Circular San Antonio is trying to do is elevate the businesses that are truly local, right? So we think about the shoe cobblers, the seamstresses, the many general contractors that rehab our existing buildings, the deconstruction contractors that we're building up locally. These are people that live here, that work here, that pay taxes here, that spend money here, and believe that San Antonio is where they want to be. And if we invest in more of those people in those industries, that's what circularity is.
Mm.
So I think leveraging kind of the identity and the community and the cohesion that is so unique to this city is the key to unlocking more reefs.
Mm. I love that. Well, and Stephanie, I'm curious for folks listening or watching, what are some physical projects that exist in San Antonio? If someone was curious to see this very tangibly, um, either from what you think really emphasizes circularity, the principles of circularity, or likewise deconstruction. What's something that someone could go see in San Antonio that would reflect that?
I think a really big example is something that our office launched a few years ago, which is called our Living Heritage Trades Academy. So, related to circularity and having a workforce to reinvest in our buildings, most of the people that work in construction trades are 45 or older. And out of 100 people on a construction site, only one is a woman. So these two dimensions are intertwined in a lot of different ways. And the only way that we can really make sure that these resources stay around is to invest in the people that dedicate their time and craft and skill to doing that work. So we offer a lot of different employment pathways through our trades academy, whether it's reusing windows, restoring windows, doing deconstruction training, but we also have a lot of community workshops
Mm.
where even if you don't want this to be your business, but you want to learn a little bit more about how your house works and lives and breathes and ages, that's what we're here for. So I'm always about elevating kind of the hands-on way for people to play and learn. So I think that's one
Mm.
big way that people can get involved. But then I always encourage people to stop by and kind of just watch a house being restored or a house being deconstructed, because you can learn so much about that incredible trade
Mm.
and maybe see some things that you've never seen before, like a lumber stamp or a weird archaeological find, like a kerosene lamp that's in your front yard, which is something that actually happened to me. So there's just so much to uncover by learning more about how our buildings are restored and the materials kept in our environment.
Mm, absolutely. Well, and one final question for you, Stephanie. I'm very excited about your vision for deconstruction and the possibilities of circularity advancing in San Antonio. If you could wave a magic wand and embed, one bit of understanding or one, kind of eye-opening learning for general San Antonians, what would that be? What would you want people to see or understand that is possible in San Antonio that they may not currently?
The landfill doesn't deserve these materials, our communities do.
Mm.
And of course, I connect that with building materials, but it could mean any material that we so readily throw away, whether it's plastic or clothes or electronics, and really thinking about how those systems don't have to be the way they are.
Mhm.
And a lot of the solutions lie in our backyard. We don't have to rely on federal laws, although those would be awesome. Um, but we can kind of seek to reorient those really wasteful systems just by leveraging our own skills and connections here. So I just always challenge people to look at what is unseen, which is typically our waste system, where you put stuff at the front of your yard or the back of your yard and somehow it magically disappears and you never see it again. To think about how we can restructure those systems and keep those materials for us, because you can't build a community around a landfill.
Mm.
You can definitely build community around sharing and reuse.
Thanks for listening to or watching this episode of Big City Small Town. If you enjoyed it, please send it to a friend, share it with a colleague, helping us to keep telling San Antonio's most meaningful stories. And if you haven't yet, sign up for the San Antonio Something, my weekly newsletter where I share things to do, places to explore, and people to get to know in this city. Just head to coryames.com to subscribe. Also, be sure to check out Monday Musings, Bob Rivard's weekly newsletter, at bigcitysmalltown.com. Big City Small Town is brought to you by Weston Urban, building the city our children want to call home, and by Geekdom, where startups are born and smart ideas become businesses. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.